We're doing a launch of event for one of the reports that we've just produced called Corridors of Power, how Beijing uses economic, social, and network ties to exert influence along the Silk Road. And I just wanted to acknowledge the fact that even though I'll be making the presentation on behalf of the research team, I do have a few colleagues with me in the audience who were co-authors on the report. So Justin, Anna, Divya, Austin, and feel free to join in the Q&A session, which I'm sure will be dynamic and lots of great questions from all of you. So I wanted to provide some context setting before we get too far into the weeds of the details here. And that is the impetus for this report, I think. You know, if we take a step back and we think about all the discrete examples we see of Beijing's bid for influence in Central Asia. So from a Confucius Institute to a public infrastructure project, or a Chinese diplomat using social media to amplify preferred narratives, it is clear that we see China all around us. But despite these visible signs, you could say that we have fairly minimal details on specifics. So which countries and communities receive more of Beijing's attention and why? And how has this evolved over time? How are communities even responding to these overtures from Beijing? And what does that mean for other foreign powers? And to what extent do these tools work as standalones, or are they more than the sum of their parts? And these are all good reasons why we wanted to do a study like this. But of course, this is not a single study on its own in isolation. So AidData has a long-standing program looking at trying to understand how to quantify China's influence around the world. We initially started focusing on China's financial tools and economic statecraft, but then increasingly saw China beginning to experiment with more and more examples of soft power tools, education and culture, exchange, and the like. And so because of that, over a series of several reports, this is the fourth report in the series, we've been trying to find ways to quantify Beijing's inputs in its public diplomacy overtures with other countries, but also try to understand some of the outcomes in terms of perceived influence on the part of general publics, foreign publics, as well as foreign leaders. To date, we've done this looking at public diplomacy across 40 Asia-Pacific countries, including 13 in South and Central Asia, which is the focus of our conversation today. So to dive in then a little bit, what is included in this Corridors of Power report? So we look at 2 decades of Beijing's public diplomacy from 2000 to about 2020. We look at this, like I said, across 13 South and Central Asian countries. We consider 3 different facets of China's overtures with countries in the region, efforts to build economic, social, and network ties. Interestingly, we look not only between countries, but what is happening within countries and where do we see similar and different patterns of behavior? And what might that tell us about Beijing's revealed priorities? And then finally, we think about perceptions of China, not in a vacuum, but in a way of comparing what is happening vis-a-vis China to other foreign powers. And so maybe just to dive right in, looking at several different avenues of potential influence. So the first being economic ties. These are overtures that are intended to increase economic interdependence, integration between countries. One of the tools that we look at most closely here is something we call financial diplomacy. So in terms of financial diplomacy, we're talking about 4 different types of state-directed financing from the Chinese government to counterpart countries. This includes aid that is both grants and concessional lending, as well as debt instruments, so non-concessional loans that approach market rates. We also look at 4 different categories of assistance in the report. So two that are more visible to the general public: infrastructure financing and humanitarian aid, as well as those prized by foreign leaders, so thinking about budget support and debt relief. What we do see across the region as a whole is that even though Beijing uses both aid and debt instruments, the bulk or the lion's share that is oriented towards South and Central Asia is in the form of debt financing, about 74% of it, and also in the infrastructure arena, 95%. Given the focus of this particular event today on Kazakhstan, I think it's worth noting that Kazakhstan alone attracted 26% of Beijing's financing during this period. It's the second largest recipient overall in terms of China's financial diplomacy. And it also is notable because it fits into a broader category of countries where we observe a pattern of behavior where China is placing relatively greater emphasis on financial diplomacy over soft power overtures at the subnational level, so within countries. And the common theme between these countries, being mostly in Central Asia, including Nepal and Kazakhstan, is that the impetus here is to gain access to energy supplies and strategic positioning for transit routes. And so hence we turn this category of subnational public diplomacy, being extract, as in short for extracting those resources. The title of this report, Corridors of Power, I think was inspired by something we observe about the way in which Beijing deploys its economic and soft power overtures. If we look beyond national boundaries, China clearly views some communities as more strategically important to advancing its interests than others. So for example, Beijing targeted 62%, so about $78 billion of its financial diplomacy efforts to just 25 provinces and 41% of its overtures to 25 districts. In practice, the top 3 province-level recipients, so these are 2 provinces in Pakistan and 1 in Turkmenistan, captured more of these dollars than 7 of the 13 countries in the South and Central Asia region. So clearly, some communities are of greater interest to China than others. In Kazakhstan, when we look at the district level, kind of the second administrative region down, it's Kazakhstan's Atirau that receives $5 billion over nearly 2 decades. It's the second largest district level recipient of China's financial diplomacy. What we do see in terms of commonalities across the board, in terms of which communities are most likely to receive China's financial diplomacy, and we conducted a series of statistical tests to be able to assess this, is that these communities they tend to be strategically positioned near natural gas pipelines, kind of an indicator of China's interest in energy security, and then also near more populous areas that represent lucrative markets for Chinese firms, goods, and capital. But as much as we're interested in China's economic overtures as certainly a cornerstone and a visible one of China's foreign influence strategy, we also recognize that increasingly China is focused on building social ties, people-to-people ties with countries and communities around the region. And so in this particular report, we focus primarily on looking at this from the dimensions of education, culture, and city-level diplomacy. So a few highlights for you in terms of the main takeaways from these social ties that China is developing. So we see that in the education realm, when you think about educational assistance that's being targeted to other countries in the region, we see that Kazakhstan actually received the greatest share of projects, so 18% of all projects during this time period, and 62% of all of the dollars associated with education assistance. Typically in this bucket of projects are efforts to focus on the hardware of education, so donating school equipment and supplies, as well as constructing school buildings. The there are examples in the software of education with regard to scholarships, technical training, technical assistance. There's also examples of joint research as well here. And this is true across the region. But over time, we see a couple of shifts happening in terms of how China is orienting its educational assistance. It started, as you can see, I'm sorry, I can just pause for a minute. Camilo, did you have a question or something we can help you with? No? Okay. Feel free to pop something in the chat if you're having difficulties. I don't want to leave you stranded as I talk. So just to continue on, you can see the benefit of looking at this over time, right? As you can see shifts in geography, Kazakhstan initially a major focus for Beijing in the early part of this period, and then by the end has tapered off. But also, interestingly enough, in terms of the substance of where China is focusing its efforts and energies, there's definitely a shift from the earlier part of the period focused on the hardware of education, kind of your building construction and your school supplies, to more of an emphasis of looking at the software of education, trying to cultivate a pipeline of students to be able to come to study abroad in China. In addition to educational assistance to other countries, China is actively involved in a game that a lot of foreign powers have been involved in for quite some time, and that is the arena of international education cooperation. And here, Beijing is really interested in becoming a premier international education destination. It's certainly on its way there, if not already there, at least pre-COVID. It remains to be seen what happens now. But in order to do that, Beijing has sought to reduce friction for international students to study in China. An example of this is the fact that we did a head-to-head comparison of what it takes if you are a South and Central Asian student from Kazakhstan or from elsewhere, and you wanted to study in the US, in India, in Russia, in the UK and the US, how difficult would it be for you how many hoops would you have to jump through to be able to study abroad? Perhaps unsurprisingly, in this particular region of Central Asia and for Kazakhstan, Russia is by far the easiest hurdle to clear. But China is just right after that. It's substantially easier when you think about considerations of the cost of visas, health requirements, proof of payment, substantially cheaper and easier for a student from Central Asia to study abroad in China than in its comparators such as the US and UK. Another way that China seeks to stoke demand for education abroad is in the promotion of scholarships. The Chinese government has been heavily involved in state-directed or state-backed scholarships for study abroad programs. We estimate that they announced almost 2,000, so 1,740 scholarships between 2000 and 2018. It was also the top sender. Kazakhstan was the top sender of international students to study abroad in China during this time, so over 90,000 during this period. Interestingly, though, you need to look at this in two different ways. So if you think about this in terms of the number of scholarships per capita, in terms of the number of students that would be of school-age population, Kazakhstan actually gets quite a large share of these scholarships. I was presenting to some folks in Kyrgyzstan this morning, though, and I said, well, you guys are number one, but Kazakhstan is pretty high up there too. But then if you look at this from the perspective of, okay, the number of students that are studying from a given country in China, it's actually Afghanistan that's far more heavily subsidized than any of the Central Asian countries. Language and culture promotion is another important part of this. It certainly can factor into choosing a study abroad destination. Although I will say that one of the interesting things we discovered in our research is that China is kind of playing two different angles at the same time, promoting Mandarin language through Confucius Institutes and classrooms, but also increasingly adopting English as English language of instruction or English medium of instruction within its own higher education institutions. Actually, a substantially large share of these institutions, over 200 of them, actually offer some form of English language curricula, which is quite astounding when you compare that against Russia. Offerings of Russian language in China, probably you're talking more in the realm of about 20 to 30 institutions offer something like that. In terms of promoting Mandarin language and culture, though, this is another example of a soft power tool that this has been around for a while. And in fact, if we did a comparison looking at Russia, India, and the US, and the UK, looking to see how they had historically deployed language and cultural promotion for, English, for Russian, etc. And what we see is that Russia, India, and the US in particular have much longer standing presence in terms of their institutions. Some of these go back to the 1940s, 1950s, depending upon where you are in the region. And the first Confucius Institute in comparison for China was in 2004 in Tashkent. And so it's a relatively late to the party, but it's made up for lost time substantially. Already China accounts for 30% of the region's language and cultural institutions. Pretty large share in Kazakhstan in particular. Just over a quarter of all of these institutions are from China itself. And then it's also worth noting that a similar dynamic we see to what I described earlier about economic ties is also playing out in the social ties arena. And that is, we see concentrations of Beijing's efforts and overtures, not everywhere in a country, but in particular areas of a country. We identified, actually, we looked across several different measures that we could quantify at a subnational level. Not all of them we could do. But for example, looking at sister cities, which twin or pair a province or city in China with a counterpart in South and Central Asia. We looked at Mandarin language testing centers, Confucius Institutes, and then also content sharing partnerships, which are a strategy that Chinese media employ to broker agreements with local counterpart media in other countries to be able to share content. So if you are a local newspaper in Kazakhstan, you could broker an agreement with Xinhua News and be able to plug and play that content in your local newspaper. And so when we look across these four different types of local level ties, if you will, we identified 193 of them across the region, over 174 cities. But what's interesting is that, yes, they are diverse, they are diffuse, but they are also heavily concentrated. We find that if you look at where the majority of this attention is going, it's over half, 52%, were in the top 16 cities. And in those top four, since we're focused on Kazakhstan here, that does include one from Kazakhstan, that's Almaty, which had 7 connection points that we captured. Not as many as the 2 cities in Kyrgyzstan or one in Kathmandu, but this is not necessarily exhaustive, but it does give you a feel of relative prioritization. The third avenue I'm not going to talk extensively about, just given the overall less prominence of use of social media in Central Asia for various restrictions, but then particularly Twitter is problematic in a place Turkmenistan, where it's completely banned, but it's still present in the region, and so it's worth speaking about just a little bit. And so why include this in a report about China's influence in South and Central Asia? I think it's worth including a look at this because social media is really an extension, a new frontier of people-to-people diplomacy, you could say. Now, with a click of a virtual button, states can reach foreign publics at scale, but with greater personal appeal, perhaps, than international broadcasting. And we've seen examples, scholars and media have looked at the fact that China is waking up to this fact that social media, and particularly Twitter, can be a powerful tool to amplify preferred narratives about China or to dampen criticism or counter-criticism that's out there. But a lot of the other studies that have been done tend to look at particular tactics that China is employing, or particular campaigns, or particular individuals. But they don't really ask a more fundamental question, and that is, regardless of whatever your narrative is that you're trying to promote, your success is heavily mediated by your access to the target audiences you care about. And that is really the question for us to consider here, is to what extent can Chinese affiliated accounts actually be able to reach their target audiences in other countries. So in this particular report, we looked at this in a unique way. We assembled a novel data set of accounts across, so looking at this from the perspective of elites within South and Central Asia countries. We went through a systematic process to be able to identify leaders and organizations across parliament, the executive branch of government, civil society, private sector, and media. And then looking at the counterpart accounts in China, they tend to be much more focused on state-run media, diplomats that are tasked with an overseas presence, either based in consulates or embassies, or based in foreign affairs back in China. But because Twitter itself is kind of banned from use within the country, it's much more of this external orientation. This includes 67 accounts from Kazakhstan that we were able to identify that actually could be included in this analysis. What we see are a couple of things that are worth highlighting, and again, I won't dwell on this overly, but we find that that very few South and Central Asia leads in our sample were connected to the PRC accounts that we were looking at. And so what does this actually mean in practice? This means that China becomes ever more reliant on a small number of what we call important brokers for access. Those people that, if we connect to them, it's not just connecting to one person, but it's connecting to their network of connections. In terms of the PRC's own presence, I mentioned earlier, it's heavily centralized, heavily emphasizes state-run media, People's Daily, China Daily, major newspapers that are pushing out information to South and Central Asia communities. But when it comes to the receiving end, their ability to push out information is only as effective as their ability to break through to gatekeepers within South and Central Asia countries. And here you'll see a list. We did this across all of the different countries in the region. We identified the top gatekeeper, the most important broker for China to gain access to a much broader audience in other countries. What I will say briefly is that the nature varies depending upon which sub-region you're talking about. In South Asia, it tends to be a lot more focused around individual politicians and journalists. In Central Asia, as you might imagine, just given a relative dearth of social media use, it's a lot more reliant on access via government agencies, particularly in the case of Kazakhstan, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. So at the end of the day, we looked at economics, we looked at social, we looked at network ties that China is trying to make, but putting efforts into public diplomacy is not an end in and of itself. China hopes to achieve various ends, advance its interests through these channels. And so we looked in this report at one dimension of this, which is perception. Perceptions of favorability of China vis-a-vis other foreign powers. And we looked at this in two respects. One was from the view of citizens using a nationally representative survey called the Gallup Roll Poll, which some of you may be familiar with, from 2006 to 2020, so a nice, really long time period to examine. And then we also fielded a snap poll survey of leaders and policy elites in the region. This is something that AidData routinely does. We maintain an in-house sampling frame of about 100,000 people across the world that are carefully curated based off of their positions within government agencies, civil society, the private sector, media, and the like. So what did we find when we actually took a look here? So a few things come out that are noteworthy. So overall, citizens tended to prefer Russia and China in relative terms, relative to India and the US as the comparators. But in absolute terms, there was kind of a bucketing, if you will, of groups across the region. So Pakistan and Tajikistan kind of being fairly consistently favorable towards China year after year. On the flip side of the spectrum, you have citizens from India being consistently unfavorable towards China year after year. Perhaps not all that surprising, given that India views China as one of its premier regional rivals. And then I would say that the rest of the region is kind of middle of the road in terms of their attitudes towards China. In Kazakhstan, it's worth mentioning that there has been high volatility and that China has seen and experienced a decline in perceived favorability of its leadership, about 15 percentage points from 2006 to 2020. And, but at the same time, even if that's the case, it's still gaining traction or closing the approval gap with its nearest competitor, Russia. And the US. So it's narrowing the field, if you will, even if it's declining in popularity. I guess in a sense, everybody's declining in popularity. When we look at this question of how does Beijing's public diplomacy translate into perceptions, we looked at this in several respects. We looked at this in terms of the fact that in the past we have seen that China has historically, its cultural diplomacy, its Confucius institutes have historically been associated with more favorable views. We've also seen this in the past with some aspects of its media diplomacy. Financial diplomacy has had a mixed return in the past. We've seen kind of differences between countries and approval versus disapproval rates. In this instance, we drilled down a little bit farther and we saw that countries that received relatively more of China's financial diplomacy versus the soft power tools, those extract countries of which Kazakhstan is a part, tended to have more favorable views of China than those that did not fall in that category. But interestingly enough, too, reactions towards other foreign powers are also unpredictable. And so it's a mixed bag for China in relative terms. We see that exposure to more of China's financial diplomacy was associated with lower approval of Russia, perhaps a sense of a replacement effect. But higher approval of the U.S. and our running theory of this, and perhaps we can discuss in the Q&A, is that there have been studies that have been done that have seen a difference between when projects are initiated to completion and different trends for the U.S. versus China. So China tends to get a bump at the start when you initiate projects and then sometimes sees waning approval over time. The US traditionally is seen as the opposite, the flip side of that. And then the other thing that we looked at in terms of some of the thinking about downstream outcomes or influence of Beijing's public diplomacy overtures is looking at this question of head of government visits. So visits by President Xi Jinping, for example, Hu Jintao. These visits are noteworthy because they often come with other commitments, other announcements that are coming out regarding economic cooperation or social or cultural exchange. And similar to what we described with the financial diplomacy, the results have been mixed. And what's interesting here is a head-to-head comparison of Kazakhstan and India. We exploited the variation in when people were interviewed as part of the Gallup roll poll to better understand what the effect of actually having a head of government visit would do in terms of your approval or disapproval of China. What we see is a mixed bag. On the one hand, a single visit from Xi Jinping was associated with a 6 percentage point bump for approval among Indian citizens. We don't really see the same thing for Kazakhstan. There's not a statistically significant result we can point to, but at least the trends on the surface appear that actually we may see a souring of approval towards China after one of these visits. So definitely the context matters. And then the final set of things that I wanted to share with you is with regard to elites and leader perceptions. There's often a question in Central Asia and elsewhere, do citizens and leaders see eye to eye? And if they don't, why? And, and what are those differences? So we asked questions of our sample of SNAP poll respondents. And one of the questions we asked them was about their attitudes towards 4 of our foreign powers, China, the US, India, and Russia, in terms of their perceived favorability. And we found that slightly different result than what we described earlier. And while SCA citizens tended to prefer Russia and China, elites tended to prefer the US and India. So about 70% that were surveyed viewed the US and China favorably the US and India favorably as compared to only 40% for Russia and China. Interestingly, though, there was one area in which elites gave higher marks to China over all of its strategic competitors, and that is with regard to the ability to adapt its public diplomacy to the era of COVID-19. That actually was something I hypothesized might be the case, and it's nice when the data matches up with your expectation. We didn't plan that, but it did anyway. And then, of course, we also drilled down on some questions to respondents to talk about, okay, for those that held favorable attitudes towards the US and China in particular, we wanted to understand what might be driving that from their perspective. So what were their reasons or rationale? And what kind of floats to the top actually for both China and the US together is economic opportunity. The economic clout of these countries as potential partners is quite appealing, is quite important. This is consistent to a lot of the anecdotal evidence we've heard as well from interviewing people on the ground. It's also interesting though, when you look at, we asked a question about, well, okay, so what could the US and China do to improve favorability or standing with citizens and leaders in South and Central Asia in the coming years? And certainly economic considerations came up to close to the top, so providing more financial assistance or financial diplomacy, but also equally important was people-to-people ties, and perhaps indicating once again that economics and people-to-people diplomacy may go best hand in hand. The economic opportunity is often a stated driver for why people want to study in China or why they want to learn Mandarin. But then also, if you think about the process of socialization as people are studying in China, building networks in China, learning the language and the culture, those are also the networks they are going to when they think about the systems and the standards for professions. They're thinking about how to access goods and services and capital. It's more natural to do so in networks that you've already established through these people-to-people ties. And so then before we break and I open it up to your great questions and the discussion, just three high-level takeaways from me across this work. So the first is that, there's a lot of attention on the volume of China's public diplomacy and just the scale and the size and the speed that we see it doubling down on investments around the world. But seldom do we take stock of the fact that it's developing what I would call narrow but deep corridors of power or influence with certain subsets of communities within these countries, as opposed to just diffusely across them. Secondly, I think we do see indications of China being very adept at synchronizing multiple economic and soft power tools together to add up to more than the sum of their parts. But as I alluded to at the very last section, yes, economics and soft power might go together, but this is not a linear process of converting inputs into influence. And it is certainly not straightforward nor quick. We've seen China make some gains in terms of popular and leader perception, certainly have gained some concessions as a result of that. But, as we have seen too, it's struggling very much so to displace the inertia of long-time standing partners like Russia, for example, in Central Asia, at least among elites. So it's got quite a ways to go. So with that, I hope that was helpful and informative. The report is now live. We will also be having the data available later this week. We have a dashboard up, and we hope that even though this was a first brush pass at trying to quantify some of these tools and demystify what's going on, that this provokes and sparks the next generation of research that others might do. So with that, I'll pause my share and open it up to questions.